Elijah. Thank you. All right, so we're going to be passing out the essays that we're going to look at today. Just as a reminder, those of you who may not have been here in the latter part of this year, we're looking at some of G.K. Chesterton's essays. This is something that we've done over the last 2 years. Last year we spent part of the year in the adult Sunday school reading through Pilgrim's Progress and kind of teaching you how to read Christian literature in a Christian way. Earlier this year, we did The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, and so the session allowed me to introduce you to some of G.K. Chesterton's work, although they declined permission to let me share orthodoxy with you, which I think is the best of his work. Maybe we'll eventually get to that. The session is going to be meeting later this week, and one of the recommendations that we're going to be discussing is actually changing the Sunday school plan. There is a possibility that we're going to shift to another theme here in the next couple of weeks. Not because I think they're displeased with this, but there's some other pressing needs. So I'm kind of mindful of the fact that my plan is changing right now. At least I'm anticipating that it's going to change. So what I'm going to do today is share with you several short essays to try to introduce to you a particular theme within Chesterton's work. And then, Lord willing, if we get another week or two on Chesterton, I want to talk to you some about his views on education at the very least. There's a lot more material that we could go over, but we may have to abbreviate this just a little bit. The goal of all of this is to help you think Christianly. So that's a phrase that Harry Blameyers popularized years ago, thinking Christianly. And so we're learning to see the world through a Christian lens. And writers like G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis are among the very best at helping us do that. So we're not studying the Bible here, obviously, and there are things that Chesterton wrote that, while fantastically entertaining, might not be the most fruitful material to cover in a Sunday school, but each thing that we do read and discuss like this is with the goal of helping you think Christianly about the world that you live in and to discover the magic and the wonder of it, okay? So I've given you a few short essays today. The first, The Terror of a Toy. Second, Child Psychology and Nonsense. Then The Equality of Sexlessness. And then finally, On Keeping a Dog. And these four might not seem thematically related to you. We spent a couple of weeks looking at some of Chesterton's work on marriage and the family, and that the theme there was obvious. The theme today may be a little less obvious, but what I want you to do is help you realize that as Chesterton views the world through this Christian lens, as he discovers the wonder of living in God's world, he is able to identify the absurdity of that which is not of God. The absurdity of that which is not of God. And I think you're going to see that in these essays in different ways. And so that's going to be kind of the thought I want you to keep in mind as we go through it. All right, I'm going to start reading The Terror of a Toy. This appeared in Fancies versus Fads in 1923. He says, "It would be too high and hopeful a compliment to say that the world is becoming absolutely babyish." Now think about what he said there. It would be too high and hopeful a compliment to say that the world is becoming absolutely babyish. For its chief weak-mindedness is an inability to appreciate the intelligence of babies. On every side we hear whispers and warnings that would have appeared half-witted to the wise men of Gotham. Only this Christmas I was told in a toy shop that not so many bows and arrows were being made for little boys because they were considered dangerous. It might in some circumstances be dangerous to have a little bow. It is always dangerous to have a little boy. But no other society claiming to be sane would have dreamed of supposing that you could abolish all bows unless you could abolish all boys. With the merits of the latter reform, I will not deal here. The merits, the pros and cons of abolishing all boys. He says, well, I'm not going to discuss that. There is a great deal to be said for such a course, and perhaps we shall soon have an opportunity of considering it. For the modern mind seems quite incapable of distinguishing between the means and the end, between the organ and the disease, between the use and the abuse, and would doubtless break the boy along with the bow as it empties out the baby with the bath. Okay, so this is how he's setting it up. Chesterton has a way of perceiving wonder, truth, absurdity in everything. In everything. This is why I read Chesterton continuously throughout every year. I want to be more like Chesterton. I want to live with a sense of wonder and cheer and Christ-centeredness that just exudes from Chesterton's pen. But I don't naturally. That's not the way that I am naturally. And so I'm hoping by just immersion in his work and osmosis over many, many years, I'll pick up on some of that. So he sets this up in terms of a conversation with a toy shop owner around Christmas time, and they're saying, we're not selling many toy bows and arrows because those are too dangerous. Second paragraph. But let us, by way of a little study in this mournful state of things, consider this case of the dangerous toy. Now, the first and most self-evident truth is that of all the things a child sees and touches, the most dangerous toy is about the least dangerous thing. There is hardly a single domestic utensil that is not much more dangerous than a little bow and arrows. He can burn himself in the fire. He can boil himself in the bath. He can cut his throat with the carving knife. He can scald himself with the kettle. He can choke himself with anything small enough. He can break his neck off anything high enough. He moves all day long amid a murderous machinery, as capable of killing and maiming as the wheels of the most frightful factory. He plays all day in a house fitted up with the engines of torture like the Spanish Inquisition. And while he thus dances in the shadow of death, he is to be saved from all the perils of possessing a piece of string tied to a bent bow or twig. When he is a little boy, it generally takes him some time even to learn how to hold the bow. When he does hold it, he is delighted if the arrow flutters for a few yards like a feather or an autumn leaf. But even if he grows a little older and more skillful and has yet not learned to despise arrows in favor of aeroplanes, the amount of damage he can conceivably do with his little arrows would be about 1/100th part of the damage that he could always, in any case, have done by simply picking up a stone in the garden. Now, Chesterton's got a larger point that he's going to make. But to understand the simple point that he's making, and like parents, maybe not parents in this congregation, but parents need to understand this. You are constantly trying to baby-proof your house. You are constantly trying to keep away from your children everything that could conceivably be hurtful, and the only way to do that is to duct tape them in bubble wrap and leave them on the floor. That's about the only way. You cannot baby-proof a house. You have to house-proof your baby. And you cannot save society by banning dangerous toys. Because as Chesterton says, the most dangerous toy is the least dangerous thing in this child's world. Now you do not keep, paragraph 3, you do not keep a little boy from throwing stones by preventing him from ever seeing stones. Now, this connects to what we said earlier in the sermon. Why does God take such a dangerous tree and put it right in the middle of the garden? Because that's where it can teach man the most. That's where man learns, don't eat from that tree. This is the way you learn the knowledge of good and evil, is by revelation. If you remove from a child every possibility of transgression, they don't ever learn obedience. I will tell this story. I know this is being recorded, so this might get me in trouble, but my kids have grown up with this story. Our firstborn child before Hannah was born was Keontae, right? Little boy from a single mom in the congregation, and she had this little baby that she couldn't take care of, and so he was the first child I ever potty trained, he was the first child I ever spanked, he was the first child I ever taught how to live in a house that has firearms in it. And the way that we taught Keontae to live safely in a house that has firearms in it was by unloading a firearm, showing it to him, explaining him what the rules were, and then putting it on his play table and telling him don't touch it. So, well, fantastically irresponsible. Nope, it went on his play table. Keontae, that's a gun. We don't touch guns. I sat down in the room, pretended to read a book until he walked over and touched the gun. At which point I spat at his hand. I said, Keontae, that's a gun. We don't touch guns. I sat down, pretended to read my book until the second time, a few minutes later this time, that he went over and touched the gun. I spat at his hand and I said, Keontae, that's a gun. We don't touch guns. The third time, Keontae, as I'm pretending to read my book, walks over to the table and does this. I'm not kidding. Like, it was so comic. Like, I'm trying not to laugh. And then he looked over at me and he said, that's a gun. We don't touch guns. Never had to worry about the kid, right? You don't protect your children by removing every possible dangerous thing around them, because you can't do that. The world is full of danger. You have to teach them wisdom. You have to teach them wisdom, not simply remove every possible danger that there is in this world. The children that get in trouble with guns are the children that have not been taught what a gun is and what not to do with it. He continues, you do not do it by locking up all the stones in the Geological Museum and only issuing tickets of admission to adults. You do not do it by trying to pick up all the pebbles on the beach for fear he should practice throwing them into the sea. You do not even adopt so obvious and even pressing a social reform as forbidding roads to be made of anything but asphalt, or directing that all gardens shall be made on clay and none on gravel. You neglect all these great opportunities opening before you. You neglect all these inspiring vistas of social science and enlightenment. When you want to prevent a child from throwing stones, you fall back on the stalest and most sentimental and even most superstitious methods. You do it by trying to preserve some reasonable authority and influence over the child. Well, there's a radical idea. You trust to your private relation with the boy and not to your public relation with the stone. And what is true of the natural missile is just as true, of course, of the artificial missile, especially as it is a very much more ineffectual and therefore innocuous missile. A man could be really killed, like St. Stephen, with the stones in the road. I doubt if he could be really killed, like St. Sebastian, with the arrows in the toy shop. But anyhow, the very plain principle is the same. If you can teach a child not to throw a stone, you can teach him when to shoot an arrow. If you cannot teach him anything, he will always have something to throw. If he can be persuaded not to smash the archdeacon's hat with a heavy flint, it will probably be possible to dissuade him from transfixing that headdress with a toy arrow. If his training deters him from heaving a half brick at the postman, it will probably also warn him against constantly loosening shafts of death against the policeman. But the notion that the child depends upon particular implements labeled dangerous in order to be a danger to himself and other people is a notion so nonsensical that it is hard to see how any human mind can entertain it for a moment. The truth is that all sorts of faddism, both official and theoretical, have broken down the natural authority of the domestic institution, especially among the poor. And the faddists are now casting about desperately for a substitute for the thing they themselves have destroyed. Now, this relates to some of what we saw in the drift from domesticity. Modern progressive leftism, Chesterton's writing 100 years ago, right? We are just in a state of seeing the fruit mature that Chesterton was working against, Machen was working against, Lewis was working against a long time ago. That progressive leftism has destroyed the family and then is looking around to say, what in the world are we going to do? How are we going to control the kids? What are we going to do in place of the parents? Well, how about you leave the parents in place and empower them to do what God gave the parents to do? The normal thing is for the parents to prevent a boy from doing more than a reasonable amount of damage with his bow and arrow. and for the rest to leave him to a reasonable enjoyment of them. Because the child can enjoy a bow and arrow if he's taught what it's for and how to use it. You don't have to ban it. You just teach him how to play with it. Officialism cannot thus follow the life of the individual boy as can the individual guardian. In other words, the state cannot do what the family can do. They can't. They can't. It's not possible. They're trying. They've been trying for a long time. They can't succeed. You cannot appoint a particular policeman for each boy to pursue him when he climbs trees or falls into ponds. So the modern spirit has descended to the indescribable mental degradation of trying to abolish the abuse of things by abolishing the things themselves, which is as if it were to abolish ponds or abolish trees. Perhaps it will have a try at that before long. Thus we have all heard of savages who try a tomahawk for murder, or burn a wooden club for the damage it has done to society. To such intellectual levels may the world return. There are indeed yet lower levels. There is a story from America. Remember, Chesterton's writing from the UK. There is a story from America about a little boy who gave up his toy cannon to assist the disarmament of the world. That couldn't have been Greta, because it's a little boy. It's too long ago. Maybe her great-grandfather. I do not know if it is true. But on the whole, I prefer to think so. For it is perhaps more tolerable to imagine one small monster who could do such a thing than many more mature monsters who could invent or admire it. Now, what is he saying? The child who says, I don't want to have a toy cannon because I think the world should be free of weapons of warfare. He says, well, that kid's a little bit of a monster, but I'd rather have a little kid that's a little bit of a monster than a whole bunch of adult monsters in the government trying to do the same thing. There were some, doubtless, who neither invented nor admired. It is one of the peculiarities of the Americans that they combine a power of producing what they satirize as sob stuff with a parallel power of satirizing it. And of the two American tall stories, it is sometimes hard to say which is the story and which the satire. Oh, how I wish God had given us Chesterton in the 21st century. I have not gotten over the fact that he died so long ago. I needed him to live as long as Methuselah. Wouldn't you love to hear what Chesterton would have said about COVID and BLM and transgenderism and woo! Would have been awesome. But it seems clear that some people did really repeat this story in a reverential spirit. And it marks, as I have said, another stage of cerebral decay. In other words, if you are the kind of adult who thinks that a child giving up his toy cannon because he wants to see the world disarmed, he says something is wrong with your brain. It's broken. You can, with luck, break a window with a toy arrow. But you can hardly bombard a town with a toy gun. If people object to the mere model of a cannon, they must equally object to the picture of a cannon, and so to every picture in the world that depicts a sword or a spear. There would be a splendid clearance of all the great art galleries of the world, but it would be nothing to the destruction of all the great libraries of the world if we logically extended the principle to all the literary masterpieces that admit the glory of arms. When this progress has gone on for a century or two, it might begin to dawn on people that there was something wrong with their moral principle. What is wrong with their moral principle is that it is immoral. That right there. This is why you should read Chesterton. That right there. What is the problem with the moral principles that govern progressivism in the Western world? The problem is that the moral principle that they affirm is immoral. As soon as you have that, that's the key that unlocks a lot of issues. You simply need to see the moral principle is immoral. Arms, like every other adventure or art of man, have two sides according as they are invoked for the infliction or the defiance of wrong. Those are the two things you can do with a weapon. You can inflict wrong or you can defy wrong. The solution for bad men with weapons are good men with weapons. They have also an element of real poetry and an element of realistic and therefore repulsive prose. The child's symbolic sword and bow are simply the poetry without the prose, the good without the evil. The toy sword is the abstraction and emanation of the heroic, apart from all its horrible accidents. It is the soul of the sword that will never be stained with blood. There's no doubt that bad men have done terrible things with swords and bows. What does that have to do with the heroic sword and bow of the child? It would be too high and hopeful a compliment to imagine that the world was becoming more babyish. Would that it were so. Chesterton says it's not. More's the pity, okay? So, you able to track the argument there? It's not just about little children. It's not just about toys, but he can take a conversation in a toy shop and a social question and problem of dangerous toys, and he can extract from that a larger discussion about the way that the world is. And you can't change the way that the world is by social engineering, even though that's exactly what progressives are trying to do and have been for a long time. All right, let's go to the next one, child psychology and nonsense. You knew that we wouldn't get through all four, right? In this age of child psychology, nobody pays any attention to the actual psychology of the child. Have you noticed this? As soon as you make something an academic discipline, I am tempted to give many illustrations of this, including some in my own field. Like, we have so many theologians who are professional academics who seem to care nothing about God or Scripture or the church. As soon as you make something an official discipline, we cease to care about the subject that we are supposedly occupied with. In this age of child psychology, nobody pays any attention to the actual psychology of the child. All that seems to matter is the psychology of the psychologist and the particular theory or train of thought that he is maintaining against another psychologist. Most of the art and literature now magnificently manufactured for children is not even honestly meant to please children. The artist would hardly condescend to make a baby laugh if nobody else laughed or even listened. These things are not meant to please the child. At best, they are meant to please the child lover. At the worst, they are experiments in scientific educational method. And again, if we have only one more week, you are going to get to hear some of what Chesterton says about education. Beautiful, wise, and witty lyrics like those of Stevenson's Child's Garden of Verses will always remain as a pure, lively fountain of pleasure for grown-up people. But the point of many of them is not only such that a child could not see it, it is such that a child ought not to be allowed to see it. And then he gives an example. The child that is not clean and neat, with lots of toys and things to eat, he is a naughty child, I'm sure, or else his dear papa is poor. Is that meant for children? No. That's a social commentary, disguised as a child's poem. That is making a particular point for adults. It's not for children, even if, supposedly, it's supposed to be. No child ought to understand the appalling abyss of that afterthought. No child could understand, without being a snob or a social reformer or something hideous, the irony of that allusion to the inequalities and iniquities with which this wicked world has insulted the sacred dignity of fatherhood. The child who could really smile at that line would be capable of sitting down immediately to write a Gissing novel and then hanging himself on the nursery bedpost. In other words, he would descend into despair and become a nihilist. But neither Stevenson or any Stevensonian, and I will claim to be a good Stevensonian, ever really dreamed of expecting a child to smile at the poem. It was the poet who smiled at the child, which is quite a different thing, though possibly quite as beautiful in its way. And that is the character of all this new nursery literature. It has the legitimate and even honorable object of educating the adult, in the appreciation of babies. It is an excellent thing to teach men and women to take pleasure in children, but it is a totally different thing from giving children pleasure. Do you see the distinction he's making? He's not objecting to having literature, media, other kinds of influences that teach adults to take pleasure in their children, but he's saying that's not what children's literature is for. Now, the old nursery rhymes were honestly directed to give children pleasure. Many of them have genuine elements of poetry, but they are not primarily meant to be poetry because they are simply meant to be pleasure. In this sense, Hey Diddle Diddle is something much more than an idyll. It is a masterpiece of psychology, a classic and perfect model of education. The lilt and jingle of it is exactly the sort that a baby can feel to be a tune and can turn into a dance. The imagery of it is exactly what is wanted for the first movements of imagination when it experiments in incongruity. For it is full of familiar objects in fantastic conjunction. The child has seen a cow, and he has seen the moon. But the notion of the one jumping over the other is probably new to him, and is, in the noblest sense in the noblest word, nonsensical. Cats and dogs and dishes and spoons are all his daily companions and even his friends. But it gives him a sort of fresh surprise and happiness to think of their going on such a singular holiday. He would simply learn nothing at all from our attempts to find a shade of humor in the political economy of the poor papa, even if the poor papa were romantically occupied, not in jumping over the moon, but at least in shooting it. Do you see the difference? So here we have a contemporary child's verse that is actually a social commentary on inequities in society. And then we have Hey Diddle Diddle, which is awesome. We take all of these things that the child knows and we put them together in ways that the child has never seen. And it awakens his imagination. It awakens his imagination and delight, and it's catchy, and it's fun, and he can perceive the rhythm, and he can dance to it. Of course, there is much more than this in Hey Diddle Diddle. The cow jumping over the moon is not only a fancy very suitable to children, it is a theme very worthy of poets. The lunar adventure may appear to be, to some, a lunatic adventure, but it is one round which the imagination of man has always revolved, especially the imagination of romantic figures like Ariosto and Cyrano de Bergerac. The notion that cattle might fly has received sublime imaginative treatment. The winged bull not only walks as if shaking the earth amid the ruins of Assyrian sculpture, but even wheeled and flamed in heaven as the apocalyptic symbol of St. Luke. That which combines imagination so instinctive and ancient in a single fancy so simple and so clear is certainly not without the raw material of poetry. And the general idea, which is that of a sort of cosmic Saturnalia or season when anything might happen, is itself an idea that has haunted humanity in 100 forms, some of them exquisitely artistic forms. It would be easy to justify a vast number of the other nursery rhymes in the same vein of a more serious art criticism. If I were asked to quote 4 lines which suffice to illustrate what has been called the imaginative reason when it rises almost to touch an unimaginative unreason, for that point of contact is poetry, I should be content to quote 4 lines that were in a picture book in my own nursery. The man in the wilderness asked of me, "How many strawberries grow in the sea?" I answered him, as I thought good, "As many red herrings as grow in the wood." Everything in that is poetical. From the dark, unearthly figure of the man of the desert with his mysterious riddles, to the perfect blend of logic and vision which makes beautiful pictures, even improving them impossible. But this artistic quality, though present, is not primary. The primary purpose is the amusement of children. And we are not amusing children. We are amusing ourselves with children. That's the point that he's making. So what he's just said, if you're not following the essay, is he's saying, look, as a literary critic, you could take Hey Diddle Diddle apart And you could draw on ancient mythology and Assyrian archaeological artifacts and all of these different mythological tropes that are contained in that verse, but he says that's not what it's about. That's not what it's about. And you could dissect in kind of a rational way this verse from Chesterton's own nursery experience, but that's not the point. He said it was there to entertain the child. And he says what we're doing today with children's literature is we're not trying to entertain the child. We're trying to entertain adults and talk to adults about children. Our fathers added a touch of beauty to all practical things. So they introduced fine, fantastic figures and capering and dancing rhythms which might be admired even by grown men into what they primarily and practically designed to be enjoyed by children. But they did not always do this, and they never thought mainly of doing it. What they always did was to make fun fitted for the young. And what they never did was turn it into irony only intelligible to the old. Now, if you've paid attention, I noticed this when my kids were young. There were not a lot of like contemporary movies that we let them watch. We mainly raised our kids on like old stuff. But there were some movies, right? And some children's and animated movies that, we would let them watch. But what I noticed when my children were young is that a lot of the humor in those movies was completely incomprehensible to children. That the movie was not actually made for children. It was marketed to children, but it wasn't made for children. It was made for the children's parents. Because everything in it was going over their heads, and thank God some of it was going over their heads. That's what Chesterton is talking about 100 years ago. A nursery rhyme was like a nursery table or a nursery cupboard, a thing constructed for a particular human purpose. They saw their aim clearly, and they achieved it. They wrote utter nonsense and took care to make it utterly nonsensical. For there are two ways of dealing with nonsense in this world. One way is to put nonsense in the right place, as when people put nonsense into nursery rhymes. The other is to put nonsense in the wrong place, as when they put it into educational addresses, psychological criticisms, and complaints against nursery rhymes or other normal amusements of mankind. Do you understand the point that Chesterton's making now? He's saying you need nonsense in the right place. And nonsense in the right place is where it can be appreciated as nonsense. But what you should not do is put nonsense in the wrong place, which is what serious people are doing with all of their serious ideas and all of their social programs, which Chesterton looks at and says, that's a bunch of nonsense. This is what is valuable about learning to think Christianly. Like Chesterton, if he were living today, he would not be in panic and despair and fear of dudes in dresses. He would not be panicking about the absurdity of the left. Do you want to know how I know? Because he wrote about these things over and over and over again. Let's go to the next one, the equality of sexlessness. By the way, the hardest challenge in this is all of the essays I am not getting to share with you. Like I'm reading all of these essays, and I'm like, oh, that one's so good. Oh, I've got to share that. Oh, nope. So much is being left on the cutting room floor, right? There's a lot more that you need to read that we won't get to. But the equality of sexlessness. In almost all the modern opinions of women, it is curious to observe how many lies have to be assumed before a case can be made. Just fair warning, Chesterton was a virulent critic of feminism in all of the best in biblical ways. So if you are thin-skinned on this point, you are not going to like this essay. A young lady flies from England to Australia. Another wins an air race. A duchess creates a speed record in reaching India. Others win motoring trophies. And now the king's prize for marksmanship has gone to a woman. All of which is very interesting and possibly praiseworthy as means of spending one's leisure time. And if it were left to that, even if no more were added than the perfectly plain fact that such feats could not have been achieved by their mothers and grandmothers, we would be content to doff our hats to the ladies with all courtesy and respect which courage, endurance, and ability have always rightly demanded. But it is not left to that, and considerably more is added. It is suggested, for example, that the tasks were beyond the mothers and grandmothers, nor for the very obvious reason that they had no motor cars and airplanes in which to amuse their leisure hours, but because women were then enslaved by the convention of natural inferiority to man. Those days, we are told, in which women were held incapable of positive social achievements are gone forever. It does not seem to have occurred to this critic that the very fact of being a mother or grandmother indicates a certain positive social achievement, the achievement of which indeed probably left little leisure for traveling airily about the hemispheres. Pause there for a second. Do you understand what he just said? So there were a number of women, early part of the 20th century, that were setting all kinds of records, doing all kinds of amazing things, flying around the world, setting speed records, shooting well, winning prizes. And Chesterton's like, that's awesome, great, well done. And if that's all that we're being said about it, well done. He says that's not all they're saying about it. They're saying that these women accomplished all of these things that their mothers and grandmothers never could because their mothers and grandmothers were oppressed by the patriarchy. They never accomplished anything of social significance other than having children, which seems pretty socially significant, according to Chesterton. The same critic goes on to state, with all the solemn emphasis of profound thought, that the important thing is not that women are the same as men, that is a fallacy, but that they are just as valuable to society as men. Equality of citizenship means that there are twice as many heads to solve present-day problems as there were to solve the problems of the past, and 2 heads are better than 1. And the dreadful proof of that modern collapse of all that was meant by man and wife and the family council is that this sort of imbecility can be taken seriously. The London Times, in a studied leading article, points out that the first emancipators of women, whoever they were, had no idea what lay in store for future generations. Could they have foreseen it, they might have disarmed much opposition by pointing to the possibilities, not only of freedom, but of equality and fraternity also. And we ask, what does it all mean? What in the name of all that is graceful and dignified does fraternity with women mean? What nonsense, or worse, is indicated by the freedom and equality of the sexes? That's what Chesterton wants to know. Like, what problem are you trying to fix? Now, you have to go back a couple of weeks when we read the drift from domesticity in one of the supporting complementary quotes from another work that I read you. Chesterton said, there's never been such a thing as a compatible marriage. How in the world could you have a compatible marriage when one person is a man and the other person is a woman? By definition, they're incompatible. And that's the beauty and the glory of marriage. You don't want 2 androgynous person things. You want a man and a woman. And the combination is awesome. What is compatibility in marriage? So Chesterton's asking this question. Now, here's the thing. If you don't read a lot of Chesterton, you're going to have the wrong debate. You're going to have feminists and egalitarians saying, men and women are just equal in every way. And they just live in this universal brotherhood. And you're going to be saying, nuh-uh. And that's the wrong debate to have. Chesterton's saying, what in the world do you mean? What exactly does that mean? What are the implications of that? He is asking his interlocutor to define his terms, to define his position. He's asking a question that would be expressed a few decades later by the question, by what standard? We mean something quite definite when we speak of a man being a little free with the ladies. What definite freedom is meant when the freedom of women is proposed? If it means merely the right to free opinions, the right to vote independently of fathers and husbands, what possible connection does it have with the freedom to fly to Australia or score bullseyes at Bisley? You see, the egalitarians in Chesterton's day are using these achievements in sports as an argument to say we should dismantle the family and we should dismantle households. And every androgynous human thing in the household should exist as an independent person thing. And Chesterton says, what does one thing have to do with the other? If a woman can fly to Australia, awesome, that's great. What does that have to do with the role and responsibility that she has in society when she had a distinctive role and responsibility? Because newsflash, there's a lot of things women can do that men can't do. And why is the reverse of that offensive? If it means, as we fear it does, freedom from responsibility of managing a home and a family, an equal right with men in business and social careers at the expense of home and family, then such progress we can only call progressive deterioration. Now remember what Chesterton has already said about the family. He has said that the family is superior to the state. That the family and the home is a kingdom that cannot, not just should not, cannot be replaced or infringed upon by the state. That's the argument he's made. And that every wife and mom is a queen in that domain. In other words, he objects to feminism not because he hates women or he wants women oppressed or he wants women abused, but he does not want them dethroned. Woman, according to Scripture, is the glory of the glory. Man is the image and glory of God, and woman is the glory of man. And you say that's so demeaning. Really? Putting glory on top of glory is demeaning to women? Okay, if that's your position. See, Chesterton is arguing that the position of the feminist and egalitarian is actually disrespectful and disempowering to the woman who has accomplished something socially that her granddaughters don't ever appreciate. Your mothers and grandmothers couldn't have done this, and not just because they hadn't invented cars and planes yet, but it's because they were birthing you and raising you and masters of a domain that you have abandoned in order to set land and air records. Well done. And for men too, there is, according to a famous authoress, a hope of freedom. Men are beginning to revolt, we are told, against the old tribal custom of desiring fatherhood. The male is casting off the shackles of being a creator and a man. When all are sexless, there will be equality. There will be no women and no men. There will be but a fraternity, free and equal. The only consoling thought is that it will endure but for one generation. All right, I did not get to on keeping a dog, so let me just say something about it. It is the essay that will help you perceive something that Chesterton addresses multiple times in multiple places, and that is the utter absurdity of evolution. Evolution. And evolutionary thought. And modern naturalistic scientism. And he uses his relationship with a dog to make that point. But you'll have to read that on your own time, okay? All right, I hope those essays you were able to track, hope you were able to follow. Obviously, we went a little faster. I didn't throw in any extra quotes. And maybe there were points that were confusing to you. I'm happy to chat about it with any of you. That's our time. Kids are looking through the window, wanting their parents. So I'm going to pray, and then you can go be kings and queens to all of your children. They should all have toy bows and arrows. Just teach them how to use them. Don't baby-proof your house, house-proof your baby.